Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So just today I put up some images. I was actually going through some old photos and I found some old images I managed to capture from Arundel Castle showing one of two examples of a Federschwert, so-called Federschwert. This is the type of fencing sword used for longsword practice and competition fencing, both now and in the 15th and 16th centuries. I won't talk a lot about Federschwerts or even talk about those weapons at Arundel Castle very much, other than to say I put these photos up on the Scholar Facebook page, which if you haven't liked already, go and like it now, link below. And essentially, there were a few comments, quite interesting points, but one point that came up is how come they're in such good condition, whereas you look at our practice swords, our Federschwerts, and which they were probably never called Federschwerts in period, but again I'll talk about that in another video. And why are they in such good condition? And my answer is probably because they were never used. They may have been, polished up, they may have been repaired. There's all sorts of other possible reasons for why they might be in good condition. But the point that I want to make in this video is that the majority of swords that survive as antiques or in museums, if they're in good condition, it's because they weren't used. And this is something that a lot of people, it takes them a little bit of time to get their head around the fact that the majority of weapons that have been made in human history weren't actually ever used for anything. The majority of military rifles never actually get taken to war. The majority of swords just got worn in their scabbards and never got drawn in anger, or even if they got drawn they didn't actually get to stab or cuss anyone or defend from another sword or a bayonet or a poleaxe or whatever. So the majority of swords in history that still survive today have been essentially, it's like natural selection in the world of nature. The swords that are in museums are often in museums because they're either very high quality or in very good condition. And if they're in very good condition, ask yourself, why are they in such good condition? In many cases it will be because they weren't actually used. And we know with Victorian swords, like most of these here, except that's earlier, but the rest of them are Victorian, we can actually tell whether they were used in war or not by virtue of the fact for this period that they were kept blunt until they were taken on campaign. So many swords, for example, let's see, these are bad examples actually. I've just realised pretty much all of these are service sharpened. Ah, no, that one isn't. There we go. So that one, if I just slide it out of the scabbard, oh, that's wrong, it is service sharpened. So these are bad examples, but I do have other swords lying around. Here we go, here's one. This has never been service sharpened. Oh no, it has. So there we go. I tend to buy I seem to buy a lot of swords that are service sharpened, but believe me, I have lots of swords which haven't been service sharpened, and what that shows is they weren't taken on service. All they were done, they may have been worn for years. They may have been worn on parade. They might have even, been taken to places where conflict might have been possible, but there wasn't a war going on at the time. But essentially they weren't sharpened because they weren't expected to be used, and probably in most cases they weren't used. And even in the medieval period, people might go, oh well, that's the Victorian period. It goes for all periods. The majority of swords in the medieval period would have spent most of their time being worn. And even the ones that were drawn in anger, even if they were used in in a fight or in warfare, there's every likelihood that they would have then only seen a few contacts with an enemy weapon, or not even that. You look at the actual context of where swords were often used in medieval warfare. It was often when the enemy were routing and you were riding them down. So if you look at something like the Battle of Towton, for example, there's every possibility that someone would be using a lance or a poleaxe or or bill, whatever their primary weapon is, and only really once the enemy were fleeing do you maybe think, okay, this weapon's a bit cumbersome to be chasing after people with, and you drop the bill or you drop the poleaxe or whatever, and you pull out a sword, you get on your horse and you charge after them and start skewering people. So even in that situation, yes, the sword was used, but there won't be any damage to the sword in a lot of cases because it's not coming into contact with other weapons. So there are all sorts of reasons why a historical sword or any other weapon might have no signs of damage at all. In many cases that's because the weapon was never actually used in anger, and in some cases it's because even when a weapon is used in anger, it doesn't always result in damage or signs of use to the sword or to the weapon itself. And the final thing I'll mention is quite fair to point out that the weapons I was originally talking about are fencing weapons, but not all fencing weapons get used either. I have seen lots of, in antique shops and auctions and all sorts of things, I've seen lots of antique fencing foils and sabres and all sorts of things that very clearly were never used. They were bought as stock and they were put into a fencing club or into stores or an armoury or whatever, and it just so happens that one or two or three of them or whatever, or even in a shop, and they weren't sold, those weapons didn't get to be used, and because they didn't get to be used, they were kept in good condition, and therefore they were kept and they survived the modern age. The weapons that were damaged, the weapons that were notched up or bent or had any, signs of essentially damage to the weapon, be it the hilt or the blade or whatever, were recycled. They were thrown away. So if you have a sword and you use it in war, and we know this happened historically, whether it was in the 19th century or any of the earlier centuries, if you have a sword that gets badly damaged in battle, there's every likelihood that you will scrap that weapon. You'll sell it to someone, and the metal can be recycled into making knives or whatever, and you'll get a recycled, essentially a bit of money back for selling the messed up weapon, and you'll put that into buying a new weapon. You're not going to go around with a bent or broken or notched up sword. You just buy a new one. Swords and all weapons are tools. Okay, so there we go, a few views on why many historical weapons in museums and elsewhere and in antique collections, and like some of my swords, are in very good condition. It's because many of them didn't get damaged and many of them weren't used. That's the headline. Okay, so lots of weapons in history just never got used. Cheers folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.